Tonight, we delve into one of the most frequently misconstrued elements of medieval existence, hygiene, or, more accurately, the startling absence of it. We've all encountered the jests about medieval people never washing, discarding their refuse into the streets, and dwelling in conditions that would render a modern landfill spotless. However, the reality was a peculiar blend of better and worse than these perceptions imply. The authentic narrative of medieval hygiene presents a convoluted, compelling, and occasionally revolting account, illustrating the stark differences in life prior to germ theory, indoor plumbing, or any concrete grasp of disease transmission. Therefore, before you allow romanticized visions of this historical era to take root, please consider liking this video if you appreciate these in-depth explorations of historical truths, and share in the comments your listening location and current time. It's consistently fascinating to observe our global gathering of history enthusiasts settling in for the evening with truly eye-opening narratives. Now, lower the lights, adjust your comfort, and prepare for a rather sobering expedition. Because when it comes to cleanliness in the Middle Ages, the truth is considerably more sordid than most individuals imagine. Envision this. You are navigating the thoroughfares of London in the year 1350. It's a warm summer day, and the initial sensation that assails you is not the sight of majestic cathedrals or vibrant market stalls, but the smell. An overpowering, sickening odor that seems to emanate from all directions simultaneously. From the gutters awash with sewage, from the heaps of refuse decaying in neglected corners, from the unwashed populace surrounding you, from the animal excrement carpeting the cobblestones, and from the open cesspits that punctuate the cityscape like festering sores. You observe a woman open her second-story window and discharge the contents of a chamber pot into the street below, scarcely bothering to issue a warning to passers-by. The liquid splashes onto the stones, augmenting the river of filth that meanders down the street's center. A pig forages through a mound of discarded food, vying with rats and stray dogs for sustenance. A butcher deposits animal carcasses into the gutter, where they will decompose until the next rainfall disperses them, or, more likely, simply spreads them further. This was the reality of medieval sanitation standards, a situation far more intricate and varied than commonly understood. The medieval epoch was not a homogeneous era of darkness where everyone suffered from equal filth and ignorance. Perceptions of cleanliness fluctuated significantly, contingent upon the specific period, geographical locale, social stratum, and individual inclination. Certain medieval individuals were remarkably diligent regarding personal hygiene, while others endured circumstances that would appall even the most stoic modern sanitation operative. This evening, we embark on an examination of every facet of medieval hygiene. We will explore how individuals bathed or refrained from doing so, how they managed human effluvia, their oral care practices, their laundry routines, their comprehension of illness, and their endeavors in public sanitation. We shall uncover why the medieval era witnessed both sophisticated bathhouses and streets flowing with sewage. We will ascertain why some people bathed daily while others abstained for months. We will understand why the very notion of cleanliness held a meaning entirely distinct from its contemporary interpretation. Our investigation will encompass the Church's influence on attitudes towards bathing and bodily purity, the repercussions of the Black Death on hygiene customs, and the surprising sophistication of certain medieval sanitation frameworks. We will encounter the gong farmers responsible for emptying cesspits, the barber surgeons who extracted teeth and performed bloodletting, and the everyday citizens who strove to maintain a semblance of cleanliness in a world seemingly engineered to promote dirt. For the truth is, medieval hygiene, or its lack thereof, transcended mere matters of being dirty or clean. It was intrinsically linked to survival in an epoch where disease was poorly comprehended. Water was frequently unsafe to drink, soap was a costly commodity, and sanitation infrastructure was either rudimentary or absent. It involved making difficult choices amidst competing priorities when resources were scarce and knowledge was limited. The medieval approach to hygiene had profound ramifications for public health, social interactions, economic advancement, and the very fabric of medieval society. The epidemics that thrived in unsanitary environments claimed millions of lives and irrevocably altered the course of history. The social stigma associated with certain occupations dealing with waste and cleanliness fostered rigid class distinctions. The lack of understanding concerning disease transmission led to practices that exacerbated, rather than remediated, the situation. Most significantly, perhaps, the medieval experience with hygiene, despite its failures and intermittent successes, forged the path for the public health revolutions that would ultimately transform human existence. The harsh lessons learned over centuries of plague, pestilence, and filth would eventually give rise to modern sanitation systems, germ theory, and the public health infrastructure we now take for granted. Therefore, let us commence our journey into the unsanitary yet captivating world of medieval hygiene. Let us discover why maintaining cleanliness in this era would have been a formidable challenge, why disease was so rampant, and why the very air you inhaled would have been saturated with the effluvium of human existence. Because comprehending medieval hygiene is not merely about acquiring historical trivia, it is about appreciating the progress we have achieved and understanding the immense obstacles our ancestors confronted in their daily struggle for survival. The streets are summoning us, the cesspits are overflowing, and the truth regarding medieval hygiene is poised to be unveiled in all its gritty, malodorous, and shocking detail. Before we immerse ourselves in the genuine squalor and grime of medieval life, it is imperative to address one of the most enduring myths concerning the Middle Ages: the notion that people of this era never bathed, that they were universally unclean, and that they possess no understanding of personal hygiene whatsoever. While this stereotype contains elements of truth, it represents a gross oversimplification that obscures a far more intricate and intriguing reality. The myth of the perpetually unwashed medieval individual largely originated in the 19th century, when Victorian historians and writers were constructing narratives about the Dark Ages, emphasizing the supposed barbarism and backwardness of the medieval period in contrast to their own supposedly enlightened era. These narratives served a purpose. They bolstered the Victorian sense of superiority and legitimized their own social and political structures. However, they were not entirely accurate. The reality is that attitudes towards bathing and personal cleanliness varied profoundly throughout the medieval period, which itself spanned approximately a millennium from the 5th to the 15th century. In the early Middle Ages, particularly in regions that had once been part of the Roman Empire, public bathhouses remained prevalent, and bathing constituted a regular aspect of life. The Romans were enthusiastic bathers, and their infrastructure and cultural practices did not vanish overnight with the empire's collapse. Indeed, throughout much of the medieval era, public bathhouses were common in European cities and towns. These establishments, known colloquially as stews or bagnios, offered hot baths, steam rooms, and various grooming services. They functioned as social hubs where individuals from all walks of life would congregate to bathe, converse, conduct business, and occasionally engage in activities that incurred the church's disapproval. The existence of these bathhouses and the regulations that govern them strongly indicate that bathing was considerably more widespread than the prevailing stereotype suggests. Medieval medical texts and advisory manuals frequently addressed bathing and personal hygiene. Physicians recommended regular bathing for health reasons, although their understanding of its benefits was often rooted in humoral theory rather than any concept of germs or bacteria. They believed that bathing helped balance the body's humors and could ward off or cure various ailments. These medical recommendations were taken seriously by those who could afford to implement them. The wealthy and nobility certainly bathed regularly, often in elaborate wooden tubs filled with heated water by servants. These baths might be infused with the scent of herbs and flowers, and bathing frequently became a social affair, with family members or guests sharing the same tub. Illuminated manuscripts from the medieval period frequently depict individuals bathing, suggesting that it was a normal and unremarkable part of daily life. However, and this is a significant caveat, attitudes towards bathing began to shift in the later Middle Ages, particularly in the aftermath of the Black Death, which ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century. The plague claimed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population, prompting desperate searches for explanations for this cataclysm. One theory that gained traction posited that bathing, especially in public bathhouses, facilitated the spread of disease by opening the pores and permitting pestilence to enter the body. This theory was, of course, entirely incorrect, The plague was transmitted by fleas on rats, not by bathing. Nevertheless, it had a profound impact on bathing practices. Public bathhouses began to close, and individuals became more apprehensive about bathing, particularly in hot water. By the 16th century, bathing had become considerably less common than in preceding periods, and it is around this time that the stereotype of the unwashed medieval person truly began to take hold. Yet, even during periods when full-body immersion was less frequent, people still practiced other forms of hygiene, such as regularly washing their hands and faces. Particularly before meals, they would replace their undergarments made of linen, which absorbed perspiration and bodily oils, and the act of donning fresh linen was considered a mark of purity. To mask bodily odors, they utilized perfumes, aromatic herbs, and pomanders, while also meticulously grooming their hair, trimming their nails, and maintaining their appearance through various means. The very notion of cleanliness in the medieval era differed significantly from contemporary understanding. Medieval individuals did not grasp the concept of germ theory, which posits that unseen microorganisms can instigate illness. Consequently, their approach to hygiene was predicated on different principles. Their concern lay with visible grime, offensive smells, and preserving social standing. They attributed disease to unfavorable atmospheric conditions, known as miasma, imbalances in the body's humors, or divine retribution. Therefore, their hygienic practices were directed at addressing these perceived causes, rather than eradicating germs. Social standing profoundly influenced hygienic customs. The affluent possessed the means to employ servants for heating bath water, purchase costly soaps and perfumes, and frequently change their attire. They also benefited from superior housing that offered greater privacy and more effective sanitation. Conversely, the impoverished often resided in congested, unsanitary environments with limited access to potable water and no resources for elaborate hygienic routines. For them, basic survival superseded cleanliness. Geographic location also played a role. Urban centers were generally less sanitary than rural locales due to the density of the population and deficient waste management infrastructure. Southern European cities, influenced by Islamic and Byzantine traditions that advocated for bathing and cleanliness, often exhibited better hygiene practices than their northern counterparts. Coastal regions possessed more convenient access to water for bathing compared to inland territories. Religious perspectives on bathing and the body were complex and occasionally contradictory. On one hand, the Church proclaimed the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit, deserving of proper care. Cleanliness was equated with piety, and monks and nuns were expected to adhere to specific hygiene standards. On the other hand, excessive preoccupation with the body and physical appearance was deemed vanity and a deviation from spiritual devotions. Certain religious ascetics intentionally abstained from bathing as a form of self-mortification. The Church's stance on public bathhouses was particularly ambivalent. While these establishments were acknowledged as essential for public health, they were also associated with immorality and sin. Bathhouses often employed female attendants who offered services beyond mere bathing, becoming notorious as centers of prostitution. The Church repeatedly attempted to regulate or shutter these establishments with varying degrees of success. Gender also impacted hygienic practices. Women were generally expected to uphold higher cleanliness standards than men, especially concerning their attire and grooming. However, they also encountered greater restrictions regarding access to public bathing facilities and had to navigate intricate social codes of modesty and propriety. Pregnant and menstruating women faced particular taboos and limitations related to bathing and cleanliness. The cyclical nature of medieval life also affected hygiene. During winter, when water was scarce and heating, it was expensive and arduous, bathing became less frequent. In summer, with more readily available water, and the heat making bathing more appealing, people bathed more often. Agricultural calendars also influenced practices. During demanding harvest seasons, individuals had diminished time and energy for elaborate hygienic routines. The availability and expense of soap were additional critical factors. Soap was manufactured from animal fats and wood ash. Although available throughout the medieval period, it was relatively costly, putting it out of reach for many. The poor might resort to sand, ash, or other abrasive materials for personal and item sanitation. Soap quality varied immensely, ranging from crude, harsh formulations that could damage the skin to fine, scented varieties considered luxury items. The quality and availability of water were perhaps the most significant determinants of medieval hygiene. In numerous areas, clean water was scarce, and the available water was frequently contaminated with sewage, animal waste, and other pollutants. People recognized that certain water sources were safer than others, but lacked an understanding of the underlying reasons. They might avoid water with an unpleasant odor or appearance, but had no means to detect unseen contamination. Water supply infrastructure differed considerably. Some cities boasted aqueducts, wells, and public fountains that supplied comparatively clean water. Others relied on rivers and streams that also served as conduits for waste disposal. In rural areas, individuals might possess private wells or undertake lengthy journeys to procure water. The effort involved in obtaining water led to its judicious and careful use. The prevalent myth of the dirty Middle Ages overlooks the substantial regional and cultural variations in hygiene practices. For instance, Islamic Spain possessed a sophisticated bathing culture, inherited from Roman and Islamic traditions, featuring elaborate public baths and a strong emphasis on cleanliness. Byzantine Constantinople, throughout the medieval period, preserved Roman bathing traditions. Even within Western Europe, practices varied considerably by locale and temporal period. Therefore, while it is accurate that medieval hygiene standards were generally lower than modern ones, and that many medieval individuals lived in conditions we would deem unsanitary, it is inaccurate to assert that medieval people never bathed or lacked any concept of cleanliness. They did indeed bathe, they did concern themselves with hygiene, and they did endeavor to remain clean, but they did so within the constraints of their knowledge, resources, and cultural context. Comprehending this nuanced reality is crucial, as it allows us to appreciate the genuine difficulties medieval people faced in maintaining hygiene, rather than simply dismissing them as ignorant or uncivilized. It also aids in understanding the evolution of hygiene practices over time and how they were shaped by factors such as disease, religion, economics, and social structures. With this context, we can now delve into the specific facets of medieval hygiene, including bathing customs, waste disposal methods, dental care, and all other elements that constituted the complex and often challenging reality of staying clean during the Middle Ages. Despite the stereotype of the unhygienic medieval person, public bathhouses were in fact commonplace and popular throughout much of the Middle Ages, particularly from the 12th to the 15th centuries. These establishments, known by various names such as stews, bagnos, baths, or simply hothouses, were an integral part of urban life and reveal an aspect of medieval culture that often surprises modern observers. However, they were also sites of controversy, disease transmission, and social tension that ultimately contributed to their decline. The medieval bathhouse evolved from the Roman thermae, those elaborate public bathing complexes that were central to Roman social life. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, many of these bathhouses fell into disrepair or were destroyed. But the tradition of public bathing did not vanish entirely. In regions that had been heavily Romanized, and notably those under Islamic influence, public bathing remained prevalent throughout the early Middle Ages. By the High Middle Ages, public bathhouses had become widespread in European cities and towns. A large city might host dozens of bathhouses, while even smaller towns often had at least one. These establishments were overseen by municipal authorities who established operating standards, set prices, and attempted to maintain order and decency. The existence of these regulations indicates that bathhouses were deemed important enough to warrant official attention and control. The typical medieval bathhouse was a substantial structure, frequently constructed of stone to mitigate fire hazards, featuring multiple rooms for distinct purposes. The primary bathing chamber contained large wooden tubs, sometimes capacious enough for several individuals to bathe concurrently. These tubs were replenished with hot water, heated in a separate area, and transported by bathhouse staff. The water was changed periodically, but not after each bather, meaning that subsequent bathers essentially used water that had already been utilized by others. In addition to tubs, many bathhouses offered steam rooms or sweating rooms where patrons could sit in hot, humid air to dilate their pores and induce perspiration. This practice was believed to be beneficial for health and cleansing, facilitating the expulsion of impurities from the body Some bathhouses also incorporated cold plunge pools for bathers to refresh themselves after the hot bath or steam room. This alternation between hot and cold was considered especially advantageous for well-being. The bathhouse experience extended beyond mere cleansing. It served as a social venue for relaxation, conversation, business dealings, and social interaction. People would spend extended periods at the bathhouse, moving between different rooms, engaging with friends and acquaintances, and perhaps enjoying a meal or a beverage. For many medieval individuals, especially those residing in cramped and lacking accommodations, the bathhouse provided a rare opportunity for comfort and leisure. Bathhouses employed a diverse staff to cater to their clientele. Stokers were responsible for maintaining the fires that heated the water. Carriers transported the hot water to the tubs, and attendants assisted customers with bathing, scrubbing their backs, and providing various grooming services. Some bathhouses employed barbers who would shave clients, cut their hair, and even perform minor surgical procedures such as bloodletting and tooth extraction. The concurrent offering of bathing and barbering services within a single establishment was a prevalent and practical arrangement. A noteworthy, albeit controversial aspect of many bathhouses was the presence of female attendants known as stewholders or bathmaids. While these women assisted female patrons with their ablutions, they also extended their services to male customers beyond mere bathing assistance. Consequently, numerous bathhouses gained a reputation for providing sexual services, blurring the lines between attendant and prostitute. This association with prostitution ultimately contributed to the decline of bathhouses. The relationship between the church and bathhouses was complex. On one hand, cleanliness was linked to piety, making bathing a recognized and even essential activity. Many religious communities, including monasteries and convents, had their own bathing facilities, and monks and nuns were expected to bathe regularly, though not to excess. On the other hand, public bathhouses were associated with nudity, sensuality, and sexual immorality, all of which the church condemned. Church authorities frequently issued regulations to govern behavior in bathhouses. Mixed-gender bathing was often forbidden, with specific hours designated for men and women. Bathhouses were expected to be closed on Sundays and holy days. Prostitution was officially prohibited, though these rules were often disregarded or inconsistently enforced. The church's ambivalent stance toward bathhouses mirrored broader societal tensions between the physical and spiritual realms, between necessary bodily care and dangerous sensual indulgence. The cost of utilizing a bathhouse varied according to the establishment and the services rendered, but it was generally within the financial reach of working individuals. A basic bath might cost a mere few pennies, with additional services such as haircuts, shaves, or massages incurring extra charges. Certain bathhouses offered tiered services, providing private rooms and more luxurious amenities for wealthier patrons. The affordability of bathhouses ensured that regular bathing was accessible to a wide spectrum of urban society. Beyond their hygienic functions, bathhouses served significant social roles. They were venues where individuals from diverse social strata could interact. Although exclusive bathhouses catering solely to the affluent also existed, these establishments facilitated business negotiations, political discussions, and the maintenance of social networks. For women, whose access to public spaces was limited, bathhouses represented one of the few socially acceptable settings for interaction outside the home. The medical community acknowledged the health benefits of bathing. Medieval physicians, operating under humoral theory, believed that bathing could help balance the body's humors and alleviate various ailments. They recommended specific types of baths for different conditions, including hot baths for certain afflictions, cold baths for others, and baths infused with various herbs and minerals. Bathhouses sometimes promoted their medicinal properties, attracting customers seeking therapeutic relief as well as personal cleanliness. However, bathhouses also presented considerable drawbacks that eventually led to their demise. The practice of multiple individuals sharing the same bathing water, coupled with the warm, humid environment, created ideal conditions for the transmission of diseases. Skin infections, lice, and other parasites could easily spread among bathers. More ominously, bathhouses may have contributed to the spread of epidemic diseases, though the exact mechanisms were not understood at the time. The association between bathhouses and prostitution became increasingly problematic. Municipal authorities and church officials grew concerned about the moral corruption linked to these establishments. Some bathhouses functioned essentially as brothels disguised as bathing facilities, attracting criminal elements and fostering social disorder. Attempts to regulate or reform bathhouses often proved futile, leading to calls for their outright closure. The advent of the Black Death, which ravaged Europe in 1348 and recurred in subsequent waves, fundamentally altered perceptions of bathing. In their desperate search for explanations for the plague, some physicians theorized that bathing, particularly in hot water, opened the pores and rendered the body susceptible to pestilential air. This theory, while scientifically incorrect, the plague was transmitted by fleas on rats, not by bathing, was widely accepted and profoundly impacted bathing practices. Following the Black Death, bathhouses began to shut down across Europe. Some were closed by authorities concerned about disease transmission, while others ceased operations due to public fear of visiting them. Still others were shuttered because of their association with immorality and prostitution. By the 16th century, public bathhouses had largely vanished from most of Europe, and bathing became considerably less common than in earlier periods. The decline of bathhouses had significant repercussions for public health and hygiene. Without access to affordable public bathing facilities, many individuals, especially the poor, bathed less frequently. This contributed to the spread of diseases, particularly those transmitted by body lice, such as typhus. The disappearance of bathhouses also eliminated an important social space and altered the fabric of urban life. While some regions maintained bathing traditions for longer periods, such as the Islamic Spain and the Ottoman Empire with their popular public baths, or Scandinavia and Russia with their sauna and steam bath traditions respectively, most of Western Europe saw public bathing largely disappear. It would not resurface until the 19th century with the development of modern public baths, driven by new understandings of hygiene and disease. The medieval bathhouse thus serves as a testament to both the advancements and the limitations of medieval hygiene practices. These establishments demonstrated that medieval people valued cleanliness and were willing to allocate resources to maintain it, recognizing the health and social benefits of bathing. However, they also highlighted the risks inherent in bathing practices that did not account for disease transmission and became intertwined with moral and social issues that ultimately led to their downfall. Had you resided in a medieval city during the zenith of the bathhouse culture, it is probable that you would have visited one regularly, perhaps weekly or more often. You would have enjoyed the warmth, the cleanliness, and the social ambiance. Yet, you would also have been exposed to diseases, moral temptations, and social tensions that rendered the bathhouse a contested and controversial space. If, however, you had lived in the later Middle Ages after the closure of bathhouses, you would have found it considerably more challenging to maintain personal hygiene, contributing to the enduring stereotype of the dirty medieval person that persists to this day. While medieval bathing practices may have been more sophisticated than commonly perceived, the same cannot be said for medieval sanitation and waste disposal. It is in this area that the stereotype of medieval filth becomes uncomfortably accurate. The methods employed by medieval people for managing human waste were rudimentary, unsanitary, and often outright repulsive, creating conditions that fostered disease and made daily life unpleasant for everyone, regardless of social class. Let us begin with the fundamental question: where did medieval people relieve themselves? The answer varied greatly depending on whether one lived in a castle, a townhouse, or a rural cottage. But none of the options would meet contemporary standards of hygiene or comfort. In castles and manor houses, the affluent had access to a feature known as a garderobe. Essentially, this was a small chamber or closet built into the thickness of the castle wall, featuring a stone or a wooden seat with an opening. Waste would descend through a shaft integrated within the wall and emerge through an aperture at the castle's base, either falling into the moat, a cesspit, or simply onto the ground outside. The term "chapris quote nanao" or literally translates to "ya quote 1." These rooms were sometimes utilized for storing clothing, as it was believed that the ammonia fumes emanating from the waste would deter moths and other insects. While the garderobe represented a significant improvement over the complete absence of toilet facilities, it was far from pleasant. The shaft would become encrusted with waste, emitting a persistent stench that permeated the room. In winter, sitting on a cold stone seat within a drafty tower was an uncomfortable experience, and the accumulated waste at the castle's base created a foul-smelling mess that attracted flies and rats. Some castles featured multiple garderobes at various levels, all discharging into the same shaft, meaning that using a lower garderobe carried the risk of being struck by waste from above. In urban dwellings, most individuals lacked facilities as sophisticated as a garderobe. Instead, they used chamber pots, simple ceramic or metal containers kept in the bedroom or another convenient location. These pots served their purpose during the night, or when venturing outside was inconvenient, and their contents then needed to be disposed of. And here, the situation becomes truly unpleasant. The standard method for emptying a chamber pot involves simply casting its contents out of the window into the street below. In theory, a warning cry was supposed to precede this action. In England, the cry was "Gardez-l'eau," a corruption of the French garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. In practice, this warning was often omitted or given too late for pedestrians to evade the descending waste. Navigating medieval city streets required constant vigilance for falling refuse and preparedness to dodge at a moment's notice. The waste discarded into the streets would accumulate in the gutters that ran along the center or sides of the thoroughfare. These gutters were intended to channel waste away, ideally towards a river or stream, but they frequently became obstructed by refuse, deceased animals, and other detritus. Consequently, streets were often covered in a layer of grime that could be several inches in depth. During dry spells, this material would desiccate, generating clouds of malodorous dust. In wet conditions, it transformed into a noxious mire that splattered onto passers-by's attire and rendered pedestrian movement perilous. Some municipalities endeavored to regulate waste disposal. London, for instance, enacted legislation mandating that waste be transported to designated junkyards instead of being discarded in the thoroughfares. Paris instituted comparable ordinances. However, these statutes proved challenging to enforce, with numerous individuals disregarding them. The penalties for illicit waste disposal were often so minor that people opted to pay them, rather than endure the inconvenience of proper disposal. For those lacking access to a chamber pot, or needing to relieve themselves while out and about, the available options were limited and unpleasant. Certain cities provided public latrines, rudimentary structures equipped with seats over pits or channels that channeled waste away. These facilities were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and offered no privacy. Many preferred to simply seek out a secluded corner, alley, or courtyard to attend to their needs, further contributing to the general filth of the urban setting. Rural regions faced their own distinct waste management issues. Peasants residing in modest dwellings typically possessed an outhouse, a simple wooden construction situated over a subterranean pit. These outhouses were generally positioned a reasonable distance from the dwelling to mitigate odors, yet close enough for convenience, particularly during nocturnal hours or inclement weather. The pit would gradually accumulate waste, and upon reaching capacity, it would either be covered and a new pit excavated, or the refuse would be removed for use as agricultural fertilizer. The practice of utilizing human excrement as fertilizer was widespread in rural areas and, from an agricultural perspective, a practical approach. Human waste contains nitrogen and other vital nutrients for plant growth, and its application as fertilizer helps sustain soil fertility. Nevertheless, this method also facilitated the transmission of parasites and diseases, especially if the waste was not adequately composted prior to application. Vegetables cultivated on fields fertilized with human waste carried the risk of transmitting intestinal parasites and other pathogens to consumers. The accumulation of waste in urban centers necessitated its removal, giving rise to one of medieval society's most disagreeable occupations, the gong farmer. These individuals, also referred to as night soil men or rakers, were tasked with clearing out cesspits, privies, and sewers. They typically operated under the cover of darkness, both to spare the public the sight and stench of their labor, and because the waste was easier to handle once cooled from diurnal heat. Gong farmers would descend into cesspits, sometimes wading through human waste, and shovel it into buckets that were subsequently hoisted and loaded onto carts. The waste was then transported beyond the city limits to be discarded or sold to farmers as fertilizer. This was a hazardous and repulsive task. The noxious fumes emanating from the waste could be toxic, leading to gong farmers losing consciousness or even perishing from asphyxiation. The peril of contracting disease was immense, and the social stigma associated with the profession was profound. Gong farmers were frequently relegated to segregated living quarters and were excluded from many social gatherings. Despite the unpleasantness and danger inherent in their work, gong farmers were compensated handsomely by medieval standards, precisely because so few individuals were willing to undertake such a role. In London, gong farmers operated under city licenses and could earn several times the income of an ordinary laborer. Some amassed considerable wealth, although their riches did not afford them social standing. The substantial remuneration reflected both the indispensability of the work and the extreme reluctance of people to perform it. The cesspits that gong farmers emptied were an omnipresent feature of medieval urban landscapes. These were pits excavated beneath residences or within courtyards, often lined with stone or timber, into which waste was deposited. In principle, cesspits were designed to be watertight, to preclude groundwater contamination, but in practice, they frequently leaked, allowing waste to seep into the surrounding soil and nearby wells. This contamination of water sources was a primary contributor to illness. Although medieval inhabitants did not grasp the connection, certain cities possessed more advanced waste disposal systems. London had a network of sewers, some originating from Roman times, which conveyed waste from public latrines and select private residences to the Thames. However, these sewers were often insufficient for the burgeoning populace, and they frequently became obstructed. Paris featured a comparable system, with sewers discharging into the Seine. Yet, these early sewage systems were rudimentary compared to contemporary infrastructure, and did little to prevent the contamination of water supplies or the propagation of disease. The rivers traversing medieval cities served a multiplicity of competing functions. They provided sources of potable water, acted as routes for transportation, powered mills, and served as conduits for waste disposal. This meant that individuals frequently consumed water contaminated with sewage, leading to outbreaks of waterborne illnesses such as cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. Medieval people were aware that certain water sources were more reliable than others. They favored water from springs or wells over river water, but they did not comprehend the underlying reasons, nor did they possess effective methods for purifying contaminated water. The olfactory landscape of medieval cities was overwhelming and pervasive. The confluence of human and animal waste, decaying refuse, industrial effluents from tanneries and dye works, and the general absence of sanitation created an assault on the senses that would be unbearable to modern individuals. Medieval inhabitants adapted to these odors to a certain extent, but they remained bothered by them. The affluent employed perfumes, pomanders, and scented herbs to mask unpleasant smells, while the less fortunate had no recourse but to endure them. The link between filth and disease was not understood during the Middle Ages. The prevailing medical theory attributed illness to miasma, or bad air and foul odors. While this theory was incorrect, it did foster certain beneficial practices. People endeavored to avoid areas with particularly noxious smells, which often corresponded to the most contaminated locales. They utilized aromatic herbs and spices, which, while not actively preventing disease, at least rendered the environment more agreeable. Furthermore, they recognized that some locations were healthier than others, even without understanding the specific reasons. The lack of comprehension regarding disease transmission meant that medieval waste disposal practices inadvertently exacerbated the spread of illness. The contamination of water sources with sewage precipitated outbreaks of waterborne diseases. The accumulation of waste in streets attracted rats, which harbored fleas that transmitted the plague. The use of human waste as fertilizer facilitated the dissemination of intestinal parasites. The densely populated and unsanitary conditions within cities created ideal breeding grounds for epidemic diseases to flourish. Children were particularly susceptible to illnesses stemming from poor sanitation. Infant and child mortality rates were exceedingly high in medieval urban centers, with perhaps half of all children succumbing before the age of 5. Many of these fatalities were due to diarrheal diseases resulting from contaminated water and food. Parents were powerless to shield their offspring from these unseen threats, and the loss of children to disease was a tragic yet common occurrence. The societal and economic ramifications of inadequate sanitation were substantial. Epidemic diseases claimed millions of lives and disrupted economic activities. The unpleasantness of urban environments compelled affluent individuals to spend as much time as possible at rural estates, where the air was purer and the odors less oppressive. The necessity of employing gong farmers and other sanitation workers imposed a considerable financial burden on cities. Moreover, the pervasive filth of medieval life contributed to a sense of fatalism and resignation that permeated people's perspectives and conduct. Had you resided in a medieval city, managing human waste would have been an unceasing, disagreeable aspect of your daily existence. You would have been compelled to empty chamber pots, navigate fetid streets, endure overwhelming odors, and live with the constant threat of illness from tainted water and food. You would have accepted these conditions as normal, lacking any alternative or understanding of how circumstances could differ. Consequently, you would have been a participant in a society where the most fundamental elements of sanitation were addressed through methods that we would now deem not merely primitive, but actively detrimental to public health. If you consider medieval waste disposal inadequate, await an account of medieval dental care, or, rather, its virtual absence. The condition of medieval teeth and the rudimentary, agonizing techniques employed to address dental ailments exemplify, in one of the most visceral ways, the stark divergence of life in an era predating modern medicine. The medieval mouth was a realm of perpetual pain, progressive decay, and eventual tooth loss, impacting not only health, but also appearance, speech, and the capacity to eat. Let us begin with a fundamental premise. Medieval individuals possessed deplorable teeth. By contemporary benchmarks, nearly everyone in the Middle Ages would have experienced significant dental issues by their 20s or 30s. Cavities were commonplace, gum disease was endemic, and tooth loss was so prevalent that retaining a complete set of teeth beyond middle age was a rarity. The reasons underpinning this dental catastrophe were multifaceted and interrelated. Primarily, the medieval diet exerted a toll on teeth in ways dissimilar to modern diets. Bread, the staple sustenance for the majority, was crafted from coarsely ground flour that frequently contained fragments of stone from the milling process. The consumption of coarse bread progressively eroded tooth enamel, revealing the softer dentin underneath, and rendering teeth more susceptible to cavities. This continuous grinding action also wore down the occlusal surfaces of teeth, sometimes to the level of the gums. Secondly, while sugar consumption was lower than in modern times, medieval individuals still consumed foods that fostered dental decay, such as honey, a popular sweetener. Although costly and not universally accessible, those who could afford it used it frequently. Dried fruits, widely consumed and available, are also laden with natural sugars that nourish the bacteria responsible for cavities. Furthermore, the medieval practice of eating soft, cooked foods rather than raw, crunchy vegetables meant teeth were not naturally cleansed by the mechanical action of chewing. Thirdly, oral hygiene practices were rudimentary and frequently ineffective. Modern toothbrushes were absent in medieval Europe. Instead, people employed various methods for cleaning their teeth with differing success rates. Some individuals used a cloth to rub their teeth, which could remove superficial debris but failed to clean interdentally or below the gum line. Others utilized twigs from specific trees, fraying the ends to fashion a primitive brush. These chew sticks could be reasonably effective if used correctly, but they demanded time and effort that many people did not dedicate. Certain medieval individuals concocted tooth powders from diverse substances. These recipes often included ingredients like ground salt, crushed herbs, pulverized pumice stone, and even fragmented brick or pottery. While these abrasive powders could eliminate stains and some plaque, they also risked damaging tooth enamel if applied too forcefully. The affluent might opt for more sophisticated tooth powders, incorporating costly spices and herbs. Yet the foundational principle remained the same: scrub teeth with an abrasive substance. Rinsing the mouth with water or wine was another prevalent custom. Medieval medical texts advised rinses after meals to eliminate food particles, and this counsel was sound, irrespective of the underlying mechanism. Some individuals employed mouthwashes derived from herbs such as mint, sage, or rosemary, which possessed some antibacterial qualities and at least improved breath odor. Despite these endeavors, dental decay was largely unavoidable for most individuals. Once a cavity developed, there was no means to fill it or halt its advancement. The decay would progressively consume the tooth, ultimately reaching the pulp chamber housing the nerve. At this juncture, pain would become excruciating, a persistent throbbing agony that impeded eating, sleeping, and concentration. Medieval people characterized toothache as one of the most agonizing pains imaginable, and they were accurate. Available treatments for dental ailments were limited and often exacerbated the problem. For minor issues such as halitosis or gingivitis, individuals might resort to herbal remedies, chewing certain herbs, applying poultices to the gums, or gargling with herbal infusions. Some of these remedies possess genuine medicinal properties. Clove oil, for instance, contains eugenol, which exhibits analgesic and antibacterial effects, and is still utilized in contemporary dentistry. However, most herbal remedies offered at best marginal efficacy. For more serious conditions like dental abscesses, the sole viable recourse was extraction. This is where the situation becomes truly grim. Tooth extraction in the Middle Ages was performed without anesthesia, antisepsis, and frequently with a notable lack of skill or care. The individual undertaking the extraction might be a barber surgeon, a blacksmith, or merely a community member known for their ability to extract teeth. The procedure was brutal. Assistants would restrain the patient while the tooth extractor employed an array of instruments, pliers, forceps, or even bare hands, to grip the tooth and forcibly remove it from the jaw. The pain was indescribable. Patients would shriek, resist, and sometimes lose consciousness from the torment. The tooth might fracture during extraction, leaving fragments embedded in the jaw that would subsequently become infected. The socket would bleed profusely, and there was a constant risk of infection spreading to the jawbone or even the brain. Post-extraction, the patient was left with a bleeding socket and instructions to rinse with wine or salt water. Fortuitously, the socket would heal without complications. Unluckily, a severe infection could develop, potentially proving fatal. Even in the most favorable outcomes, the individual was left with a gap in their dentition, impacting their mastication, speech, and appearance. Certain medieval tooth extractors possessed greater proficiency than others. The most adept understood dental anatomy, utilized appropriate instruments, and strove to minimize damage to adjacent tissues. Nevertheless, even the most skilled practitioner operated without the advantages of modern knowledge and technology. They could not visualize the interior of the tooth to ascertain the extent of decay or infection. They could not numb the area to alleviate pain. They could not prescribe antibiotics to forestall or combat infection. Essentially, they functioned blindly, relying on experience and intuition. The social stigma associated with missing teeth was considerable. A complete set of white, healthy teeth signified youth, beauty, and vitality. Missing or decayed teeth indicated age, poverty, and declining health. Individuals who had lost their anterior teeth might be hesitant to smile or engage in public discourse. The affluent occasionally commissioned prosthetic teeth fashioned from ivory, bone, or even teeth salvaged from deceased individuals or purchased from the impoverished. These prosthetics were uncomfortable, operated poorly, and frequently detached at inopportune moments. Yet they represented an improvement over having no teeth. The link between dental health and overall well-being was poorly comprehended in the Middle Ages. Medieval physicians recognized that dental issues could induce pain and masticatory difficulties, but they failed to grasp that dental infections could disseminate to other bodily regions, precipitating serious systemic maladies. Abscessed teeth could lead to infections of the jaw, sinuses, or even the brain. Bacteria from periodontal disease could enter the bloodstream, affecting the heart and other organs. Numerous fatalities attributed to other causes might actually have stemmed from or been contributed to by dental infections. Children's dental health was particularly precarious. Deciduous teeth would decay and fall out prematurely, and permanent teeth often emerged already compromised. Parents lacked preventative measures and effective treatments. Children endured toothaches, infections, and the social derision accompanying poor dental condition. The pain and masticatory challenges stemming from dental problems could impede children's growth and development. The affluent generally experienced marginally better dental health than the impoverished, but the difference was not substantial. They could afford superior sustenance, including softer breads made from finely milled flour. They could afford dental powders and mouthwashes. They could engage more skilled practitioners for tooth extractions. However, they also had a greater propensity to consume sugar and honey, which promoted dental decay. Furthermore, They were equally susceptible to the fundamental deficiency, the absence of effective preventive care and treatment. Some medieval medical texts contained remarkably advanced recommendations regarding dental care. They advised regular tooth cleaning, moderation in sweet consumption, and prompt treatment seeking for dental issues before they escalated. However, this counsel was frequently disregarded or proved impractical for the majority to implement. Even when adhered to, it was insufficient to avert the inevitable progression of dental disease. The psychological toll of chronic dental pain and progressive tooth loss was substantial. Individuals endured constant or recurrent discomfort that adversely affected their mood, sleep, and functional capacity. They witnessed their teeth progressively decay and fall out. Knowing that no intervention could halt the process, they confronted social embarrassment and practical impediments to eating and speaking. This perpetual dental ordeal constituted an additional burden in lives already fraught with hardship and suffering. Had one lived in the Middle Ages, it is almost certain that significant dental problems would have manifested by one's 30s. One would have endured toothaches that induced a desire for death. One would have confronted the terrifying prospect of tooth extraction without anesthesia. Teeth would have gradually been lost, making mastication arduous and marring one's appearance with gaps and decay. All of this would have been accepted as commonplace, as everyone in one's proximity experienced the same dental plight. The medieval mouth was a locale of pain, decay, and progressive disintegration. It served as a perpetual testament to the limitations of medieval medicine and the stark realities of existence in an era predating modern dentistry. Moreover, it represented another facet of how medieval hygiene, or the lack thereof, rendered daily life uncomfortable, unhealthy, and frequently agonizing. While personal ablutions and dental maintenance were challenging in the Middle Ages, they were at least relatively swift processes. Laundry, conversely, represented an exhausting, time-consuming ordeal that could consume an entire day or more, and demanded immense physical exertion. The difficulty of washing garments during the medieval period was such that most individuals possessed very few articles of clothing and wore them until they were literally disintegrating. Understanding medieval laundry practices allows us to appreciate both the resourcefulness of medieval people and the immense disparity between their daily routines and our own. Let us commence with the fundamental fact that most medieval individuals owned a limited wardrobe. A typical peasant might possess 1 or 2 sets of outer clothing, such as a tunic or dress, perhaps a cloak for inclement weather, and a few linen undergarments. While the affluent naturally possessed more garments, even they owned considerably fewer items than individuals of comparable modern social standing. This scarcity dictated that clothing had to endure for years, making cleanliness paramount to its longevity. The medieval approach to laundry stemmed from the understanding that linen undergarments, worn directly against the skin, absorb perspiration, body oils, and grime, thereby safeguarding more valuable outer layers. The strategy was to change and launder these undergarments frequently, while washing the outer garments much less often. This made practical sense given the arduous nature of the washing process, and the necessity of preserving expensive woolens or silks, which frequent washing could damage. The undertaking of washing clothes commenced with water collection, itself a substantial chore. Water had to be drawn from wells, transported from rivers or streams, or gathered from rainfall. For a large laundry session, dozens of gallons might be required, all of which needed manual conveyance in buckets or jugs. This was back-breaking labor, almost universally performed by women, or, if the household could afford it, by servants. Once water was obtained, it required heating. Cold water alone proved insufficient for removing dirt and oils, necessitating heating over a fire. This, in turn, demanded fuel, wood, peat, or dried dung, which had to be gathered or purchased. Constructing and maintaining a fire robust enough to heat considerable water volumes demanded both time and expertise. The water would be warmed in large cauldrons or kettles, and the process of heating sufficient water for a full wash could consume hours. While the water heated, preparations for cleaning agents would commence. Soap existed during the Middle Ages, but its expense limited affordability. Medieval soaps, crafted from animal fats and wood ash, were harsh and caustic. Quite unlike gentle modern formulations, they could degrade delicate fabrics and irritate skin, requiring judicious use. The less affluent often could not procure soap and resorted to alternatives. The most prevalent substitute was lye, derived from wood ash mixed with water. Lye, being highly alkaline, effectively broke down oils and dirt, but its causticity posed risks to skin and fabric if not handled with care. Another option was urine, which, containing ammonia, served as a surprisingly effective cleaning agent. Urine was collected in pots and allowed to age, thereby increasing its ammonia concentration. While unappealing by contemporary standards, it represented a practical and efficient solution, utilizing a readily available resource. Some individuals employed other substances to aid in cleaning. Fuller's earth, a type of clay, was used to absorb oils and dirt from woolens. Soapwort, a plant that produced a lather when crushed and mixed with water, offered another possibility. Various herbs and plants were utilized for their cleaning properties or to impart agreeable fragrances to the wash. Upon heating the water and preparing the cleaning agents, the actual washing could begin. Garments were placed in large tubs or barrels filled with hot water and the chosen cleaning agent. They were then pounded, beaten, and agitated to work the cleaning solution through the fabric and dislodge dirt. This was accomplished with a wooden paddle or stick, or sometimes by hand. The physical exertion involved was immense. Envision hours spent beating wet, heavy textiles with a stick. For heavily soiled items or wool that required both cleanings and thickening, a process known as fulling was employed. The cloth would be placed in a trough with water and fuller's earth or urine, and then trampled underfoot for extended periods. This percussive motion both cleansed the fabric and caused the wool fibers to mat together, creating a denser, more water-resistant material. Fulling was so strenuous that it was frequently undertaken by professional fullers, and in some locales, water-powered fulling mills were established to mechanize the process. Following washing, clothes necessitated rinsing to eliminate cleaning agents. This again required more water, more heating, and additional physical effort. Garments were rinsed multiple times to ensure the thorough removal of all soap or lye, as residues could irritate skin and damage fabric. Each rinse involved lifting heavy, waterlogged garments from one tub to another. Once rinsed, clothes had to be wrung out to expel as much water as possible. This was done manually, by twisting the fabric to squeeze out moisture. Wringing heavy, wet woolens demanded considerable strength and could result in sore, chapped hands. Some individuals utilized a device called a wringer or mangle, comprising two rollers through which fabric was passed to extract water, but these were uncommon in average households. After wringing, clothes required drying. In fair weather, they would be spread on bushes, hung on lines, or laid on the ground to air dry in the sun. The sun's ultraviolet rays imparted a mild bleaching and sanitizing effect, beneficial even if not understood by medieval people. In inclement weather or winter, drying clothes presented a greater challenge. They might be hung near a fire, but this carried risks of ignition or smoke damage. Drying could take days in damp conditions, and garments might develop a musty odor or even mildew. For white linen items, an additional step, bleaching, was involved. Medieval society prized white linen as an indicator of cleanliness and status, but maintaining its whiteness was difficult. The bleaching process entailed spreading damp linen in the sun for days or weeks, periodically re-wetting it with water or buttermilk. The sun gradually bleached the fabric, but it was a slow process requiring constant attention. Some employed other bleaching agents like lye or urine, but these risked fabric damage if not used cautiously. The entire laundry cycle, from water acquisition to garment drying, could easily consume a full day or more. It was a physically exhausting endeavor that left women with strained muscles, rough hands, and aching backs. It is hardly surprising that laundry was typically performed only once weekly, or even less frequently for outer garments. The sheer volume of labor involved meant that maintaining clean clothes was a perpetual struggle. Professional laundresses existed in medieval towns and cities, washing clothes for affluent households, or those unable to manage their own laundry. Laundresses were often impoverished women seeking to earn income, and their work was arduous and poorly compensated. They typically worked at rivers or streams for ready water access, spending their days kneeling by the bank, beating clothes against stones. The work exacted a heavy toll on their bodies, leading many to suffer from chronic back pain, arthritis, and other ailments. The waterways used for laundry also served other purposes, such as sources of drinking water, animal troughs, and waste disposal sites. Consequently, the water used for washing could be contaminated, and the laundry process itself might spread disease rather than prevent it, Clothes washed in polluted water could harbor bacteria and parasites, which would then transfer to the wearer's skin. The inherent difficulty of laundry carried significant social and economic implications. The wealthy could afford a larger wardrobe and to employ servants or laundresses, enabling them to maintain higher standards of cleanliness. The poor, possessing few garments and undertaking their own laundry, often wore soiled, odorous clothing simply due to a lack of time, energy, or resources for more frequent washing. A person's clothing condition served as a visible social marker. Clean, well-maintained attire signified affluence and respectability. Dirty, tattered clothes indicated poverty and potential disreputability, leading those unable to keep their garments clean to face social stigma, in addition to the health risks associated with wearing soiled clothing. Children's attire presented particular challenges for cleanliness. As children frequently became dirty through play and work, parents had to reconcile the need for clean clothes with the immense effort required for laundry. Many children wore soiled garments most of the time, contributing to the proliferation of diseases and parasites. The seasonal rhythm of medieval life influenced laundry practices. During summer, when water was more abundant and clothes dried rapidly, laundry was somewhat easier. In winter, when water sources might freeze and drying proved difficult, the task became even more demanding. Some individuals simply wore dirty clothes throughout winter, undertaking a major wash in the spring. The advancement of laundry technology was slow. Water-powered fulling mills represented a notable improvement, but their primary use was in textile manufacturing rather than domestic laundry. The invention of the washboard, which simplified scrubbing, did not occur until the 18th century. The advent of modern washing machines and detergents in the 19th and 20th centuries finally transformed laundry from an exhausting ordeal into a manageable chore. Had you resided in the Middle Ages, doing laundry would have been among your most dreaded and arduous tasks. You would have spent countless hours hauling water, heating it, pounding garments, rinsing, wringing, and drying. Your hands would have been raw and sore from exposure to harsh cleaning agents and constant immersion in water. Your back would have ached from stooping over tubs and beating sodden fabric. And despite all this exertion, your clothes would never have achieved the pristine cleanliness of modern garments, and they would have deteriorated quickly due to the rigorous treatment. The medieval laundry ordeal served as another illustration of the significantly more arduous nature of daily existence prior to the advent of modern technology and conveniences. It was a chore that demanded substantial time and effort, placed a considerable burden on the body, and was never definitively completed. As soon as one load of washing concluded, garments would soon become soiled again, initiating a perpetual cycle. If you consider the challenges posed by bathing, waste management, dental hygiene, and laundry to have rendered medieval life unpleasant, we have yet to delve into one of the most pervasive and repulsive aspects of medieval sanitation: the constant presence of parasites. Lice, fleas, bedbugs, intestinal worms, and other parasitic organisms were so prevalent during the Middle Ages that they were simply accepted as an ordinary facet of life. Everyone was affected, from the humblest peasant to the most affluent noble. The incessant itching, biting, and transmission of illnesses they caused made life miserable for all. Let us begin with lice, which manifested in three varieties that afflicted medieval populations. Pediculosis capitis resided within the scalp hair. Pediculosis corporis inhabited clothing and bedding, while pediculosis pubis infested the coarse hair of the genital region. All three types subsisted on human blood, and their bites resulted in intense pruritus. However, beyond mere discomfort, lice also served as vectors for severe diseases, particularly body lice, which transmitted typhus, trench fever, and relapsing fever. Head lice were ubiquitous, with children being especially susceptible to infestations. Lice would rapidly disseminate throughout families and communities. The lice themselves were discernible to the naked eye, appearing as small, grayish insects approximately the size of a sesame seed. Their eggs, termed nits, were even more conspicuous, presenting as minute white specks adhered to individual strands of hair. Medieval individuals would dedicate hours to meticulously removing lice and nits from each other's hair, a practice known as grooming or lousing. This served a dual purpose. It was a practical necessity and a social activity, offering a means for family members and friends to bond while confronting a shared challenge. Various remedies were employed to combat head lice. People washed their hair with strong-smelling substances such as vinegar, sulfur, or mercury compounds in the hope of eradicating or repelling the lice. They would comb their hair with fine-tooth combs designed to capture lice and nits. Oils or greases were applied to suffocate the lice. Some individuals even resorted to shaving their heads entirely, though this was more common among monastic orders than the general populace. Despite these concerted efforts, lice infestations proved exceedingly difficult to eliminate completely and would inevitably reestablish themselves swiftly. Body lice presented an even greater problem than head lice due to their role in transmitting serious diseases. These lice did not inhabit the body directly, but dwelled within clothing and bedding, emerging to feed on blood before returning to the fabric. The lice would deposit their eggs in the seams of garments, where they were protected and could hatch into subsequent generations of parasites. Body lice flourished in the prevailing conditions of medieval life. Individuals wore the same clothing for extended periods, rarely laundered it, and frequently slept in their garments or in bedding that was never cleaned. The diseases transmitted by body lice were devastating. Typhus, also referred to as jail fever or camp fever, was a bacterial infection characterized by high fever, intense headache, and a distinctive rash. It was frequently fatal, particularly in crowded, unsanitary environments such as prisons, military encampments, and besieged cities. Typhus epidemics claimed millions of lives throughout the medieval era and persisted as a major cause of mortality until the 20th century, when advancements in hygiene and the development of antibiotics finally brought it under control. Fleas represented another persistent torment. These diminutive saltatorial insects fed on the blood of humans and animals, and their bites produced itchy, erythematous wheals. However, fleas were more than just a nuisance. They were the primary vector for bubonic plague, the disease that decimated between 30% and 60% of Europe's population during the Black Death of the 14th century. The fleas responsible for transmitting plague primarily resided on rats, but would also bite humans, thereby transmitting the bacteria that caused the disease. Medieval people did not comprehend the correlation between fleas, rats, and plague. They observed that plague seemed to spread from person to person and from locale to locale, attributing this phenomenon to miasma, divine retribution, or celestial influences. They remained oblivious to the fact that fleas leaping from infected rats to humans constituted the actual mode of transmission. This lack of understanding rendered efforts to control plague largely misdirected and ineffective. Fleas were so commonplace in medieval dwellings that people scarcely noticed them. They would traverse from clothing to bedding to furniture, biting anyone in proximity. Attempts were made to capture and exterminate fleas, but this was a futile endeavor. For every flea apprehended, dozens more lay concealed within the nooks and crannies of a dwelling. Some individuals employed flea traps, typically pieces of cloth or fur that attracted fleas, which could then be shaken out and incinerated. However, these methods offered only marginal efficacy. Bed bugs constituted yet another parasitic scourge. These flattened, reddish-brown insects concealed themselves during the day in the crevices of bed frames, within mattresses, and among bedding, emerging at night to feed on sleeping humans. Their bites resulted in pruritic welts and could lead to secondary infections from scratching. Bedbugs were exceptionally challenging to eradicate once they infested a household, and could survive for months without sustenance, patiently awaiting their next meal. Medieval beds provided ideal habitats for bedbugs. The straw or feather mattresses offered numerous hiding places, and the wooden bed frames presented an abundance of cracks and fissures where bedbugs could seek refuge. The practice of hanging bed curtains, while affording some degree of privacy and warmth, also created a dark, enclosed space that bedbugs favored. Some individuals attempted to combat bedbugs by regularly changing bedding, washing bed frames with strong-smelling substances, or employing herbs believed to possess insect-repelling properties. However, these measures were seldom effective. Intestinal parasites posed another significant problem, although they were less visible than lice, fleas, and bedbugs. Roundworms, tapeworms, and other intestinal helminths infected a substantial proportion of the medieval population, particularly in regions with inadequate sanitation, where human waste was utilized as fertilizer. These parasites were transmitted through contaminated food and water, and could induce a spectrum of symptoms ranging from mild discomfort to severe malnutrition and even fatality. Roundworms were particularly prevalent. These nematodes, which could achieve lengths of several inches, resided within the intestines and consumed partially digested food. Heavy infestations could lead to abdominal pain, diarrhea, and malnutrition, especially in children. The worms would occasionally be expelled in the feces, appearing as white, thread-like organisms. Medieval people recognized these worms and understood their parasitic nature, but possessed limited means of treatment. Tapeworms were even more disconcerting. These segmented worms could grow to many feet in length, inhabiting the intestines and absorbing nutrients from the host's sustenance. Individuals infected with tapeworms might observe segments of the worm in their stool or experience vague symptoms such as hunger, weight loss, and abdominal discomfort. Medieval medical texts described tapeworms and recommended various herbal remedies for their expulsion, but these treatments were often ineffective. The prevalence of intestinal parasites was directly correlated with deficient sanitation and hygiene practices. The application of human excrement as fertilizer meant that parasite ova present in the waste would contaminate crops, particularly vegetables consumed raw or lightly cooked. Contaminated water served as another primary source of infection. Furthermore, the absence of hand washing, especially after using the latrine and prior to meals, facilitated the transfer of parasite eggs from contaminated surfaces to food and subsequently to the mouth. Medieval people did acknowledge parasites as a problem and employed diverse methods to combat them. For ectoparasites like lice and fleas, they utilized strong-smelling substances and fine-toothed combs. For endoparasites, they resorted to herbal remedies believed to expel worms, such as wormwood, tansy, and garlic. Some of these remedies possessed genuine anti-parasitic properties, although they were often insufficient to completely eradicate heavy infestations. The psychological and social ramifications of continuous parasitic infestation were considerable. The itching and discomfort served as constant distractions, impeding sleep, work, or concentration. The visible presence of lice and nits was a source of embarrassment and social stigma, even though everyone was affected. The awareness that one's body harbored parasites was distressing and contributed to a general sense of revulsion towards the physical self. Children were disproportionately impacted by parasites. They were more prone to severe infestations due to their close proximity to other children and their less developed immune systems. Parasites could impede children's growth and development by causing malnutrition and chronic illness. Parents would spend countless hours grooming their children, meticulously removing lice and nits, yet the parasites would invariably return. The affluent achieved somewhat greater success in controlling parasites than the impoverished, but they were far from immune. They could afford to change their attire more frequently, launder their bedding more often, and utilize costly remedies and treatments. They could employ servants to undertake the tedious tasks of grooming and delousing. However, they still resided in a world where parasites were ubiquitous, and they continued to suffer from infestations, albeit perhaps less severely than the poor. The connection between parasites and disease remained understood during the Middle Ages. People were aware that lice, fleas, and other parasites were bothersome, but they did not grasp that these organisms were responsible for spreading deadly illnesses. They failed to recognize that the flea bites causing itchy welts could also transmit the plague, or that the body lice inhabiting their clothing could spread typhus. This lack of comprehension meant that efforts to manage parasites were driven primarily by a desire for comfort, rather than by a concern for preventing disease. The development of effective parasite control methods progressed gradually. The introduction of improved soaps and detergents facilitated more thorough washing of clothes and bedding. The creation of insecticides during the 19th and 20th centuries finally equipped people with effective means to eliminate lice, fleas, and bed bugs. Advances in sanitation and water purification curtailed the transmission of intestinal parasites, and the discovery of antiparasitic drugs enabled the effective treatment of infestations. Had you lived in the Middle Ages, you would have been perpetually burdened by parasites. Lice would have infested your hair, fleas your clothing, bed bugs your sleeping quarters, and likely worms your intestines. You would have dedicated hours each week to personal grooming and that of your family, meticulously removing lice and their eggs. You would have endured constant itching from flea and bedbug bites. This would have been accepted as normal, as everyone around you experienced the same conditions. Crucially, you would have been unaware that these parasites were not merely uncomfortable, but also carriers of potentially fatal diseases. The plague of parasites stood as one of the most pervasive and inescapable aspects of medieval existence. It served as a perpetual reminder of the limitations of contemporary hygiene practices and the vast disparity between medieval and modern standards of cleanliness. Furthermore, it represented yet another way in which medieval life was uncomfortable, unhealthy, and often intolerable by today's standards. We have examined numerous facets of medieval hygiene, including bathing, waste management, dental care, laundry, and parasites. However, we have yet to address what is arguably the most unsettling aspect of medieval sanitation: the handling of the deceased. In an era when death was far more prevalent and visible than in our own, when infant mortality rates were high and epidemic diseases could claim thousands within weeks, the disposal of corpses presented a constant challenge with significant implications for public health and hygiene. Death was an ever-present reality in medieval life. The average life expectancy hovered between 30 and 40 years, a figure skewed by high rates of infant and child mortality. If one survived childhood, they might reach their 50s or 60s, but would have witnessed the demise of numerous family members, friends, and neighbors throughout their life. Fatalities from illness, accidents, violence, and childbirth were common, and individuals lived with the constant awareness that they or their loved ones could perish at any moment. Upon a person's death, the body had to be attended to promptly, especially in warmer weather, when decomposition would begin within hours. The customary procedure involved washing the body, dressing it in clean attire or a shroud, and then displaying it within the home as a period of mourning before burial. This wake or viewing permitted family and friends to express their condolences and bid farewell, but it also meant that a decomposing corpse was present in the household for a day or longer, emitting unpleasant odors and attracting flies. The ritual of washing the deceased was typically performed by women, often relatives or professional mourners known as, quote. This was considered a final act of tenderness and reverence for the departed, but it was also a disagreeable and potentially perilous task. The body would be undressed, cleansed with water, and occasionally with wine or vinegar, before being clothed anew or wrapped in a linen shroud. Apertures might be plugged with cloth to prevent bodily fluids from escaping as decomposition commenced. During this process, the women attending to the body were exposed to any diseases from which the individual had succumbed. In instances of death from plague, typhus, or other infectious conditions, the layers out faced a high risk of contracting the illness themselves. Many women who earned their livelihood preparing bodies for interment perished from diseases acquired while handling corpses. Nevertheless, the task had to be accomplished, and someone had to perform it. Following the wake, the body would be transported to the church for a funeral service and subsequently interred in the churchyard. In medieval Europe, burial in consecrated ground, land blessed by the church, was deemed essential for the soul's salvation. Consequently, almost everyone was buried in churchyards, the areas surrounding parish churches. Over time, these churchyards became exceedingly congested, with bodies layered upon one another, sometimes only a few feet apart. The continuous interment of bodies in churchyards created severe sanitation problems. As the deceased decomposed, they released fluids and gases that contaminated the soil and groundwater. The effluvium emanating from churchyards, particularly during summer or after heavy rains that disturbed the soil, could be overwhelming. Flies and other insects were drawn to the decaying bodies, and rats would burrow into graves to consume the remains. In densely populated urban churchyards, the situation was even more dire. Space was limited, and new graves frequently disrupted older ones. Gravediggers routinely encountered bones and partially decomposed bodies from previous interments. These remains would be exhumed and stored in charnel houses, structures, or crypts where bones were stacked to create space for new burials. Some charnel houses were ornately decorated with skulls and bones arranged in artistic patterns, serving as memorials and memento mori. The practice of burying the dead in and around churches meant that the living were in constant close proximity to the deceased. Churches were built atop crypts filled with bodies. Churchyards, where people walked, children played, and markets were sometimes held, were effectively mass graves. The demarcation between the realm of the living and that of the dead was considerably more permeable in medieval society than it is today. During periods of epidemic disease, conventional burial practices completely broke down. When the plague swept through a city, people died at a rate exceeding the capacity for burial. Bodies would accumulate in homes, in streets, and in churches. The stench of death pervaded the entire urban landscape. Gravediggers could not keep pace with the demand, and mass graves were dug, into which dozens or even hundreds of bodies were deposited together, often without coffins or shrouds. The psychological impact of these mass fatalities was devastating. People observed their family members perish, sometimes within hours of exhibiting the initial symptoms. They witnessed bodies piled onto carts and conveyed to mass graves. They lived with the constant dread of being next. The customary rites of death and mourning were abandoned in the face of overwhelming mortality, adding psychological trauma to the physical horror. The Black Death of 1348 to 1350 represented the most catastrophic epidemic in European history, claiming the lives of an estimated 30 to 60% of the population. In certain cities, the mortality rate was even higher. The sheer volume of deceased overwhelmed all efforts at proper burial. Contemporary accounts depict bodies lying in the streets, homes filled with corpses with no one left alive to enter them, and mass graves that were filled and covered only to be reopened days later when more space was required. The handling of plague victims' bodies was particularly hazardous due to the incomplete understanding of disease transmission. While it was recognized that plague seemed to spread from person to person, leading to avoidance of the sick and deceased, the role of fleas and rats remained unknown. Consequently, precautions taken were often ineffective. Individuals who handled plague corpses, including gravediggers, priests, and family members, were at significant risk of contracting the disease. Some cities attempted to implement public health measures during plague outbreaks, mandating prompt burial, marking and avoiding houses where plague victims had died, and burning the clothing and bedding of those afflicted. These measures yielded some impact, but were frequently enacted too late and proved difficult to enforce. Moreover, because the true mechanism of plague transmission was not understood, these measures failed to address the underlying problem: the rats and fleas propagating the disease. The disposal of animal carcasses presented another sanitation challenge. Horses, cattle, pigs, and other animals succumbed regularly, and their bodies required disposal. In rural areas, dead animals might be buried or left in fields to decompose naturally. In cities, they were supposed to be transported outside city walls to designated dumping grounds, but this directive was often disregarded. Deceased animals were left in streets, discarded into rivers, or dumped in convenient but unsuitable locations. The presence of decomposing animal carcasses within and around urban areas attracted scavengers such as dogs, pigs, rats, and birds, which would feed on the remains. This fostered a cycle of filth and disease, as these scavengers themselves became vectors for disease transmission. The odor emanating from decaying animals exacerbated the general stench of medieval cities and contributed to the prevalent belief that illness was caused by miasma, or bad air. Butchers and tanners, whose work involved the slaughter and processing of animals, created particular sanitation problems. Butchers would slaughter animals in their shops or in public markets, and the blood, entrails, and other waste were discarded into the streets or nearby rivers. Tanners, who processed animal hides into leather, employed urine and other noxious substances in their operations, generating terrible odors and polluting water sources. These activities were frequently confined to specific urban districts, yet the pollution they generated impacted everyone. The medieval comprehension of decay and sickness was rooted in the miasma theory, the conviction that illness stemmed from tainted air or offensive smells. Although this theory was inaccurate, it did foster some advantageous habits. Individuals endeavored to steer clear of areas with particularly noxious odors, which frequently meant avoiding the most polluted locales. They utilized fragrant herbs and spices to mask offensive smells, rendering the environment at least more tolerable. Furthermore, they acknowledged that certain places were healthier than others, even without grasping the underlying reasons. The Church held a multifaceted stance on the disposal of the deceased. On one hand, Christian doctrine underscored the significance of appropriate interment and the eventual reawakening of the body, prompting careful handling of remains and the upkeep of church burial grounds. On the other hand, the Church's insistence on interring everyone in hallowed earth led to the overcrowding of these spaces and the resultant sanitation issues. The Church also provided some of the sole organized responses to widespread illness. Monasteries and convents frequently functioned as infirmaries. Tending to the unwell and the dying, clergy would visit those afflicted by the plague to administer last rites, despite the considerable risk of contagion. Numerous clergy succumbed during plague outbreaks, yet their dedication to serving the sick and dying offered a measure of solace and support during times of calamity. The long-term health repercussions of residing in close proximity to decaying bodies were significant. The contamination of soil and groundwater by decomposition byproducts facilitated the transmission of illness. The psychological toll of perpetual exposure to death and decay affected people's mental well-being and their outlook on existence. The normalization of death and the casual treatment of corpses during plague epidemics may have contributed to a general hardening of society and a diminished valuation of human life. Had you lived in the Middle Ages, you would have been enveloped by death in ways modern individuals rarely encounter. You would have attended wakes where decaying bodies were exhibited in homes. You would have traversed churchyards that were essentially mass burial sites. You would have witnessed plague outbreaks where bodies accumulated faster than they could be interred. You would have coexisted with the odor of death as a perpetual presence in your surroundings. And you would have accepted all of this as commonplace, lacking any alternative or comprehension of how circumstances could differ. The putrid smell of death was one of the most pervasive and distressing features of medieval existence. It served as a constant reminder of mortality, a source of contagion and contamination, and a challenge that medieval society never fully surmounted. The handling of the deceased elucidates both the shortcomings of medieval sanitary practices and the profound distinctions between medieval and contemporary attitudes towards death, illness, and the human form. As we conclude our exploration of the unsanitary yet intriguing realm of medieval hygiene, an undeniable truth emerges. Medieval inhabitants lived under conditions that we would perceive not merely as uncomfortable, but as genuinely perilous to health and welfare. The deficiency in understanding disease transmission, the rudimentary sanitation infrastructure, the paucity of resources, and the cultural perspectives on the body and cleanliness collectively fostered an environment where illness thrived and life expectancy was curtailed. However, it is crucial to acknowledge that medieval individuals were neither ignorant nor indifferent to hygiene. They did value cleanliness and made earnest efforts to maintain it, constrained by their knowledge, resources, and cultural context. They bathed when opportunities arose. They attempted to control vermin. They disposed of waste to the best of their ability, and they cultivated social norms and practices surrounding cleanliness that were logical within their world. The issue lay not in the intelligence or diligence of medieval people, but in their lack of the scientific understanding and technological infrastructure we now take for granted. They were unaware of germ theory, thus not comprehending that microscopic organisms were causing disease. They lacked indoor plumbing, impeding easy access to clean water or safe waste disposal. They did not possess modern medicine, preventing them from treating infections or averting illnesses. They were doing the most they could with the means available. The medieval experience with hygiene had profound consequences that shaped the trajectory of history. The diseases that proliferated in unsanitary conditions, plague, typhus, dysentery, among others, claimed millions of lives and influenced demographic, economic, and social developments. The Black Death alone is estimated to have eradicated between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, fundamentally altering the equilibrium between labor and capital, weakening feudalism, and contributing to the societal and economic transformations that ultimately paved the way for the Renaissance and the modern era. The absence of effective sanitation also impacted military endeavors, political stability, and economic progress. Armies were frequently vanquished more by disease than by enemy forces. Cities were periodically decimated by epidemics that disrupted trade and commerce. The perpetual burden of sickness diminished productivity and shortened lifespans, limiting human potential and economic growth. Nevertheless, the medieval period also witnessed significant advancements in hygiene and sanitation that laid the groundwork for future enhancements. The construction of aqueducts, sewers, and public fountains in certain cities indicated that infrastructural solutions were achievable. The regulation of bathhouses, butchers, and other trades impacting public health demonstrated an awareness that sanitation was a collective concern requiring governmental intervention. Medical texts that discussed hygiene and disease, though often inaccurate in their specifics, showed that people were contemplating these issues and striving for understanding. The gradual improvement in hygienic practices throughout the medieval period and into the early modern era was propelled by several factors. The devastating impact of the plague and other epidemic diseases created an impetus to seek solutions. The expansion of urban centers exacerbated sanitation problems, making them more acute and evident, compelling authorities to act. The development of new technologies such as improved soap-making methods and enhanced water supply systems facilitated the maintenance of cleanliness, and the slow accumulation of practical knowledge regarding effective and ineffective approaches led to incremental progress. The true breakthrough in hygiene and sanitation occurred in the 19th century with the advent of germ theory and the public health movement. Once scientists grasped that diseases were caused by microorganisms transferable through contaminated water, food, and person-to-person contact, developing effective preventive strategies became feasible. The construction of modern sewer networks, water treatment facilities, and public health infrastructure revolutionized urban living and dramatically reduced mortality from infectious diseases. The contrast between medieval and modern hygiene is stark and sobering. We inhabit a world where potable water flows from our taps, where waste is disposed of discreetly and efficiently, where soap and shampoo are inexpensive and readily available, where dental care can prevent cavities and address issues before they become severe, where parasites are rare and easily treated, and where epidemic diseases are controlled through vaccination and public health initiatives. We take these advancements for granted, yet they represent a monumental achievement that required centuries of effort and the contributions of countless scientists, engineers, physicians, and public health professionals. Understanding medieval hygiene allows us to appreciate the progress we have made and the debt we owe to those who developed the knowledge and infrastructure that enable modern life. It also serves as a reminder that progress is not guaranteed, and that the gains we have achieved can be jeopardized if we fail to maintain and improve our public health systems. In many parts of the world today, people continue to live in circumstances not dissimilar to medieval Europe, lacking access to clean water, adequate sanitation, and basic health care. The lessons derived from medieval hygiene remain relevant. The medieval approach to hygiene also prompts intriguing inquiries into cultural perspectives on the body, cleanliness, and disease. Medieval individuals possess different conceptions of cleanliness, varying priorities in resource allocation, and distinct understandings of the connection between physical and spiritual purity. These divergences highlight that hygiene is not solely a matter of objective scientific facts, but is also shaped by cultural values, social structures, and economic limitations. If you had been transported to medieval Europe, you would have encountered immense challenges with the daily hygiene realities. Maintaining cleanliness without modern soap, hot running water, and washing machines would have been difficult. The refuse in the streets, the urban odors, and the persistent presence of parasites would have been repulsive. The widespread prevalence of disease and the absence of effective medical treatments would have been terrifying, and the lack of understanding regarding disease transmission and prevention would have been frustrating. However, you might also have been impressed by the resilience and inventiveness of medieval people who managed to survive and even flourish in conditions we would find intolerable. You might have come to appreciate the social dimensions of bathing in public bathhouses, the collective endeavors to uphold a certain standard of cleanliness, and the practical understanding that accumulated over centuries of experience. Furthermore, you may have developed a renewed appreciation for the tremendous advancements in hygiene and public health achieved over the past few hundred years. The unsanitary reality of medieval hygiene was, by contemporary standards, indeed dirty, but it was also more intricate and varied than prevailing stereotypes imply. People in the Middle Ages did concern themselves with cleanliness. They did endeavor to remain clean, and they established customs and infrastructure that reflected the peak of their capabilities given the knowledge and resources at their disposal. The fact that their best efforts fell short of modern expectations does not indicate ignorance or apathy. Rather, it signifies the limitations imposed by their era. The narrative of medieval hygiene is, at its core, a testament to human adaptation, resilience, and advancement. It recounts individuals striving to preserve health and dignity amidst adversity, making do with restricted choices, and gradually cultivating the knowledge and instruments that would ultimately revolutionize human existence. It serves as a reminder that the comfortable, clean, and healthy lives many of us enjoy today are not inherent or predetermined, but are the outcome of centuries of dedication and innovation. As we conclude our exploration of the unsavory streets, malodorous cesspits, and vermin-ridden dwellings of medieval Europe, we can feel thankful to reside in an era of modern sanitation and hygiene. We can acknowledge the vast progress that has been made and the innumerable lives preserved through enhancements in public health. And we can recall that behind the statistics and historical accounts were actual individuals, men, women, and children who lived, loved, labored, and passed away in a world significantly more demanding and arduous than most of us can comprehend. The medieval world was a setting where the mere act of maintaining cleanliness presented a continuous challenge. Disease posed a constant peril, and the most fundamental aspects of hygiene we now take for granted were either unattainable or demanded considerable effort. It was a world that tested human fortitude and inventiveness in ways that influenced the trajectory of history and established the groundwork for the contemporary world we inhabit. The fire dwindles, shadows lengthen, and from somewhere in the distance, a church bell marks the hour. The medieval world slumbers, enshrouded by centuries of accumulated progress. Its teachings on sanitation, sickness, and human fortitude continue to resonate across the ages, serving as a potent reminder of our progress and our profound debt to past generations.